Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Maginnis is our guest today on the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast, a retired national security expert, a Fox News military analyst, and author of the new book, Out of This World, Are UFOs Aliens, Spirits, or Pure Hokum? And Bob Maginnis, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Rob, it's my pleasure.
Gosh, we talk a lot about UFOs and they're unidentified, but if we had to identify some common characteristics of what a UFO is, what would you say?
Well, over the ages, and I'm talking thousands of years, we've had all sorts of descriptions, some of which have been recorded by the federal government, others by nonprofit organizations. And if you go back, I would say into ancient history, they would describe something that was circular or disc-like, and I'm talking about things that go back 2,000 years. They were silvery, they were metallic, they were a meter or much larger. They didn't make any sound. They hovered. They had erratic movements. Sometimes they had occupants that were seen, and they were shiny or white in their clothing. And then more recently, you've seen characteristics that are just really fascinate me, certainly. They demonstrate anti-gravity propulsion, sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic speeds. They can easily navigate through all sorts of mediums, in other words, through a solid, through a liquid, through the air, and so forth. So there are a lot of characteristics, and there's a great deal of science. Until I started looking at this before writing, I didn't realize how much real solid data there was. But of course, there's a lot of quackery out there, so you have to be very careful what you believe.
It seems that the things that you describe, Bob, are really defying our understanding of physics. Is that the case? And if so, boy, that leaves a lot of questions.
Well, it does. And, I have a couple science degrees, and I've worked, in the past and lived in the U.S. space communities. And so I came to this very skeptical, and yet they defy what we understand. It's almost as if it's a new physics. I think that's one of the reasons I call in my book for really a legitimate scientific national effort to discover what this is. If it is a new physics and there's something that we don't understand fundamentally about Newton's law or a variety of other physics phenomenon, then we need to research that. Now, if there is something out there, such as extraterrestrials, like some people argue, though the government has not come to that conclusion yet, then we need to find out. And then, of course, as I argue, I think at the end of the book, that some of this, I have no doubt, is of a spiritual nature and something that we should not dismiss, although the government runs from that, very, very quickly.
Now, many people have said, or at least have speculated, Bob, that these are actual, at least some of them are actual government programs, that we have far advanced technologies that have not been sent out to the public. Is there any truth to that?
There used to be. There's no doubt. One of the reasons we formed Area 51 north of Las Vegas is to do government testing, especially of things like SR-71 and other types of aircraft that have announced and seen in public. The government continues to do a lot of secret stuff, and it has to because of the nature of the world we live in. The most recent report, which is only 2 months old, right out of the Pentagon, it's an organization, the latest of many dozens of organizations they've had at the Pentagon, called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Their report, which is only 66 pages, really delves into this at the direction of Congress, and they come to the conclusion that there's been a lot of misidentification over the years. 90+% of everything that has been reported as a UFO was either some sort of aircraft that either was misidentified or was a test aircraft, which is quite possible, or it was a meteorological balloon or something like that, or it could have been a natural phenomenon, a shooting star or something of that nature. And historically, we have seen that pan out. But the latest report, which clearly is flawed as I've gone through the analysis of it from the government, is still not answering some key questions. There's a minority of those reports that are very important, and I think we have to get to the nut as to what is the truth. Is it new physics? Is it ET? Or is it about a phenomenon that some of us would spirit or a paranormal activity that we just don't understand?
There have also been allegations that the government is holding non-human biologics. You touch on this briefly in the book. Tell us what that means, and is there any truth to that?
You have contrary reports. Now, the latest report out of the Pentagon says that that's not true. They interviewed the people that testified in Congress last summer, and that they really cannot pinpoint the location of those biologics, they call them. But there are allegations, and I record some of those in the book, as to people say that, the government has, I suppose, these extraterrestrials, parts of them or whole bodies that are being preserved somewhere, and we're working on them and the like. The government denies that. It's a matter of who do you believe. The Pentagon's recent report says this is just nonsense. If you go through all the materials, they're still not doing a very good job of answering Congress's mandate to bring clarity to this issue. And to a large degree, it's because there's been a stigma associated with this over the years, and there's been a lot of spin. And most of the programs, of which there are dozens that I outline in the book, most of those programs were more about spinning the story to, kind of evade the facts about it so that the public would stop asking questions. And, like Nick Pope, even in United Kingdom, Nick would tell me that his job was more of a PR job than it was about doing scientific investigation. So, we need to get past that. If this is a true national security issue, and a lot of F-18 pilots that have seen these things, recordings that we have and the like, say that it's a real phenomenon and it's interfering with our military training and interfering with our own security, as some would report, then we need to get to the bottom of it for obviously national security reasons, if no other reason at all.
You understand, as a national security expert and someone with a lot of military experience, Bob, how things work in government. So are these the sorts of things that a president de facto would be advised on and briefed on? Or are these above the level of the president of the United States, this sort of information?
Well, I know President Clinton, when he came into office, he promised that he'd get to the bottom of it, and he sent off one of his chief people to try to discover what the truth was. And you've had all sorts of leaders that have tried to do that. I wrote a book, The Deeper State. It's true. The bureaucracy is pretty hard to break. There are secrets within government that, we just don't willy-nilly tell anyone. And just because you get elected to president doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have access unless you really, really are very persistent and you know where to go look, then perhaps you're going to find out some things that no one knew. Such as who shot JFK, or these types of things. They're out there, and they're maybe at Langley in some deep vault, or they could be in Area 51. I'm skeptical that some of this is true. I try to dismiss a lot of what I've read as hoax. And those that I've just can't answer, I say, okay, there is an element here that we just don't understand. And I think it's at risk to our national security, and we have to find out what the answer is.
You referenced in the book that there is a lot of congregation near nuclear facilities, and also that military-related things are attracting UFO sightings and visits. Why is that? Do they know what we're doing and they're trying to figure out our level of technology, or is there something else going on?
Well, that would be the argument, I think. What we have discovered is that, yes, there are an unusual propensity for UFOs to occur around or be spotted near nuclear sites or nuclear vessels at sea, or a variety of other things, such as at Air Force Base that has nuclear-tipped missiles. And I profile some of those in the book. There are people that came out of some of these studies, that have outlined that as being a significant issue, that we have seen a propensity of these things taking place in military venues. Even RAND Corporation did a study about this time last year that looked at 100,000 different reports, and they came to the conclusion that there was a higher propensity for UFOs within a certain proximity of a military installation than there was elsewhere. Now, of course, there have been other studies that have looked at, whether it's on the West Coast or certain states or certain cities and so forth. So there's a lot of analysis out there, but no one, to the best of my knowledge, even the federal government, really hasn't honed down on the data in a way that is going to give us real answers, to a large degree, because everybody collects data differently. There's no standardization, even in the United States, much less across the world. And as a result, we have a lot of information, but we don't have a way of measuring it in a meaningful way to give us true answers.
There was a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I didn't really realize that there were first and second and third kind encounters. Would you help us understand what all those mean?
That really dates back to the 50s and 60s, when Hynek, a doctor out of Ohio State, was working for Project Blue Book for the U.S. Air Force on all things UFOs. And he put together a methodology for reporting on UFOs. He had what's called Close Encounters of the First Kind, and basically is an observation of an object at some distant range, but there's no interaction. They didn't leave a trace, in other words, on the ground or a contrail or anything. There's a Close Encounters of the Second Kind that leaves the actual physical trace, an imprint on the ground. You've seen that in a variety of these reports across the world. Or a residue, something called, that some dub angel hair, which is a gossamer-like material or glassy fibers and the like, which dissipates in a matter of hours. And then there's the third kind. It's a category in which there seemed to be a human or a humanoid that was associated with the UFO. It's interesting, in ancient history, we've seen some of those, ancient astronauts, we call them, and even in more modern history, certainly during the Middle Ages, you see a lot of Christian art that actually has, what appears to be flying saucers in very interesting Christian well-known scenes. And these things are still in art museums and churches around mostly Europe, and I identify a lot of those in the book.
Were there discussions of those at the time? Are there historical references to those inclusions in the paintings?
There was discussion, but apparently it was something that was just part and parcel about life. I mentioned something that dates back to the time of Christ, and it's a fascinating account that was documented by Josephus, of course. He was the Roman Jewish historian born in Jerusalem to priestly family. He records, and he said there were a lot of eyewitnesses to this, and this is his writing. He says, before sunset throughout all parts of the country, parenthetically I put Judea, it was, chariots were seen in the air and armed battalions hurling through the clouds and encompassing the cities. Now, he wrote that as a report from what he said were hundreds of people. That seems to be a bit odd, but when I looked at what Dr. Struthers, who wrote a piece I think it was in 2007, it was a peer-reviewed journal, and he was a NASA Harvard graduate, a NASA scientist, and the like. He wanted to delve into this whole ancient UFO phenomenon, and what he found, as I described earlier to a certain degree, is very similar to what we're seeing today. So historically, we have seen these things that have been fairly characteristic for thousands and thousands of years, which forces me to kind of draw some conclusions that we just don't want to perhaps know the answers to the questions that naturally come to our attention. If it's been around thousands of years, is this extraterrestrial or is this a spirit? And I come to the conclusion that some of this is of a unseen realm, the spiritual domain, much like we see in the Bible.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with our guest, Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Maginnis, retired, and the new book, Out of This World, in just a moment.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We continue now with Robert L. Maginnis. The book is Out of This World, Are UFOs Aliens, Spirits, or Pure Hokum? So we should talk about religion and how various religions, and then I want to go specifically to Christianity, but more generally, various religions respond to UFOs and the thoughts that there may be other alien life in our universe.
Well, there are obviously, it depends upon how you count, maybe 42,000 plus faith groups, religions in the world. You've got what I call the UFO religions. You have UFO cults, and they typically describe, if you look at their doctrine, which I do in the book, most of them believe in an extraterrestrial beings. They emphasize a relationship between the aliens and we earthlings that they've had. And of course, they have a strong belief in the numbers of encounters, how they have encounters. They believe that the aliens are here to help us in many cases, but arguably, if they're not, and we haven't seen evidence, especially recently, from some of the disturbances that are associated with this, and that's a problem. And then they tend to believe that they need to prepare the world public for the coming arrival in a very public way of the extraterrestrial beings. So these are the types of things. And of course, you have some that are really off the charts in what I would call truly weird. But at the same time, given that 65% of Americans, based on a Pew Research Center, believe that there's intelligent life outside of Earth, not sure about the here on Earth though, but these beings might be coming here. Now, if that's true, what's interesting is that we have at NASA an astrobiology effort that sends out vessels to Mars, is the Mars rover. We've sent vessels out into places beyond our own galaxy, and we put on those Voyagers these gold plates that kind of would help that ET to decipher where we are located and what we are like and so forth. So there is a conviction within government, and I think the general population, that there's something out there that it's extraterrestrial. What we seldom hear in the secular world is that there might be, in the paranormal, the spiritual world, that it might be part of this factor. And I think that that's part of what we're missing here.
So let's talk about that, particularly how Christians respond to the possibility, because there doesn't seem to be reference in the Bible the fact that there were other worlds around us with other parallel civilizations. So how does a Christian respond?
Well, I tend to align myself with Dr. Billy Graham, who was very clear on this. He says, the Bible doesn't say anything about the possibility of life on other planets. However, this doesn't mean life can't exist on other planets, for it well might. The Bible simply doesn't tell us. So if God has created life elsewhere, okay, it has to comply to the same requirements that we do. And so that there's some really interesting material out there from ethicists, especially biblical ethicists, that talk about, well, do they have to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior like we earthlings do in order to gain heaven? They deal with all of these issues. It really is something for the ontologist who is dealing with the difficult questions about, does God exist? And, if there's an ET out there, how do I deal with this sort of issue? Very, very challenging. It's very thought-provoking, but something that Christians have to deal with. But when we look in the Bible, we see evidence. I would argue that there's a possibility, and I tend to conclude that these are angels. But you look in Isaiah and Ezekiel, Zechariah, Revelation, look at Elijah, the story of Elijah in 2 Kings 2:11. In that particular account, it's pretty clear that this is something that we really here on earth don't understand. I'll just read that verse. It says in 2 Kings 2:11, and it came to pass as they still went on and talked that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Now, that has been interpreted as evidence of really a UFO type of thing, this chariot of fire. Arguably, within the context, I would say that was a spiritual, something that God used, perhaps an angel or angels, to take Elijah up. But there are others. Look at Ezekiel. Elsewhere, even in the Gospels, you see Christ interfacing with all sorts of demonic spirits that are possessing people, or with angels themselves when he was 40 days and 40 nights in the desert and they came to minister to him. So there's a lot of evidence of a spiritual domain there. And yet, when we look at what we're seeing today, it takes on many of the same characteristics that we attribute to angels, and that list, is fairly compelling in terms of they eat with people, they wrestle. Think of Jacob wrestling with an angel. Think of being injured in wrestling with an angel. Think of they're talking or ministering to someone, appearing or moving through material objects, opening doors. A host of attributes that even some of the UFO sightings tend to typify. How does an angel move? Well, it fits very well to a lot of the descriptors that we have for UFOs. They just vanish very quickly, or they move at such speed that it's hard for us to comprehend. Certainly we can't define it by our own physics.
So you mentioned angels. How about demons? Is there a dark side to this?
Well, I think there's a real dark side to this, and I think that there are certainly, if you go back to Genesis 6:4 and the like, I think that perhaps I have a couple of friends that are no longer with us, that Michael Heiser, Chuck Missler, these guys looked at this issue of Genesis 6 and about the sons of God, and whether or not these sons of God were angels and cohabited with women, and as a result they produced Nephilim. And then when the flood came, the Nephilim became disembodied spirits, basically, that lived past the flood and inhabited mankind. And of course we see evidence of that, I think, at Sodom and Gomorrah. We see evidence of it certainly in the time David, before, when he was battling with Saul, leading up into the time in which he became king. And you see it, of course, evidenced in the time of Christ. If all that is true, and I believe it is, if all that is true, why wouldn't these same disembodied spirits, what I would consider demons, why wouldn't they be evident today? Well, arguably, it's interesting. About 40-something years ago, I picked up a book by Billy Graham, Angels, God's Secret Agents, and he talks about that issue in here. And he talks about UFOs and demons and so forth. And I tend to agree with him, as well as what Chuck Missler writes in Nephilim, Return of the Nephilim, which he deals with that topic extensively. And of course, I quote Chuck, I quote Mike, and then Dr. Graham as well. I do believe that that's part of what we're going through. But, Rob, part of the problem is, as I've indicated from the very beginning, we've not taken this topic seriously. The government has spent many millions of dollars for all these projects that we've put together and paid consultation and so forth. And we've been very dismissive. It's been a public relations ploy more so than a scientific investigation. Well, it's past time, given what we do believe, I think, in the most recent Pentagon report, is that this is a threat, and it should not be dismissed. So we need to deal with it. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, I provide a formula in the book. I say there's some very clear takeaways that we have from what we've seen over the last 70 years. And those takeaways need to become kind of the focus area of what government's going to do with the help of the academic world, certainly the rest of the scientific world. I would argue with theologians need to be involved, and certainly in the media and public education. So we need all of those people and their resources to help us figure out what this is. And if it ends up being something that is truly, as I indicate, I believe it's partly a spiritual phenomenon, then we need to acknowledge that. But government has a problem, a real problem with that.
Finally, Bob, there's a lot of discussion in Christian circles today that the rapture of the church will be covered by some use of aliens and alien abductions. And I'd love for you to comment on that.
I kind of address that, Rob, at the end of the book, chapter 16, where I'm saying that the Antichrist could very well, which of course is going to happen, I would argue, after the rapture, but the Antichrist is going to perhaps be a demon that is presenting himself as an extraterrestrial. Nothing's clear to us at this 2024 looking at it as we consider what Revelation says in the Bible. But I think that's a real possibility that the rapture could come and we wouldn't have to deal with that if you're a believer in Jesus Christ. However, I believe that demons that have always tried to short-circuit what God in heaven has in mind, much less what Jesus Christ tried to accomplish. And they were constantly battling with that reality. And of course, that has been the history of mankind from the very beginning. And I think it's accelerating even now. So we need to be serious about who we are, especially for the Christian, who we are in Christ. Recognize that there's a true spiritual war, as it says in Ephesians 6, happening about us. The fact that there's a upsurge in extraterrestrial ideas in the media, Hollywood, of course, even in our skies, that we can't understand, the government can't explain it, and the government doesn't want to deal with it. Certainly the Christian community needs to see that this is part and parcel, perhaps, of us trending toward the end times. Now, I don't know when the end times is. It could be immediately on our horizon, or it could be much more distant than that. However, we need to be cognizant that we are spiritual beings, and that some of what we are seeing, I think, as I try to be as compelling as I can in the book, that we need to take that into account. This is a spiritual war, and it's not just a bunch of aliens trying to infiltrate into our lives.
Bob Maginnis, if people would like to get a copy of your new book, Out of This World, or if they'd like to follow the work that you do online, would you tell us the best way?
Google my name, because I've been doing this sort of stuff. This was a project that my publisher, Tom Horn, gave me before he died last summer, after I wrote an article for Fox News, expressing skepticism about the whole issue. And Tom said, write the book. I wrote the book. Out of This World, Are UFOs Alien Spirits or Pure Hokum? It's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, just about any place you can buy books. And I would encourage people to, if you're really searching on issues of consequence. I deal with a lot of that, and I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of questions. I have some data, and I do draw some conclusions. But I think every believer, especially, that is wrestling with this tough world we live in, they need to look at this material because I think it has some helpful information.
Robert L. Maginnis, you've done a remarkable job in the book Out of This World and covered the subject very well. Thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Well, thank you, Rob.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,